It was the first cold snap of November 1989, one of those Arkansas nights when the wood smoke hangs low over the hollows and the frost comes down hard on the bottomland. Earl Tackett locked up the sawmill office a little after 6, the way he had every weeknight for 19 years, and stepped out into the dark to walk the quarter-mile home along the gravel cut behind the mill. He was 51 years old, a foreman who knew every man on the floor by name and every machine by its sound. His wife had supper waiting. His porch light was on across the field. He never reached it. That is not a story about a man who lost his way in the dark. That is a story about a town that spent 35 years believing a comfortable lie, and the single rusted object that finally tore that lie wide open. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the mill, and to the men who worked it. Because to understand what was taken from Pell County, you first have to understand who Earl Tackett was. Pell County sat in the timbered hills of South Arkansas, a place of pine ridges and slow brown rivers, where the sawmill was the beating heart of everything. The town of Drennon, population 1,600, had grown up around that mill the way a town grows up around a church, the houses spreading out from it in rings. In 1989, the whole place still ran on the rhythm of the mill whistle. 4 blasts a day you could set your life by. And the smell of fresh-cut pine drifted through open windows from spring clear into fall. Men drove pickups with gun racks in the back glass and CB radios under the dash. And a wave from 2 fingers on the wheel was how you said hello on a county road. The diner on the square served chicken fried steak on Thursdays and gossip every day of the week. And the Friday night high school football game emptied the rest of the town out entirely. It was the kind of county where a handshake still closed a deal, where folks left their doors unlocked and their troubles unspoken, and where everyone took it for granted that the men they'd worked beside for 20 years were men they truly knew, down to the bone. Earl Tackett had given his whole working life to that mill. He'd started on the green chain as a teenager, pulling lumber until his hands bled, and he'd worked his way up to floor foreman over 3 hard decades, and he ran his crew fair and hard. He had a reputation for it across the county. When a man's hours got cut, Earl was the one who went to the office and fought for him. When the books didn't add up, Earl was the one who noticed. He was married to Ruth, his wife of 26 years, a slight, iron-spined woman who taught Sunday school. And they had 2 grown sons, one working the mill floor alongside his father, and one off serving in the Navy. Earl had a habit his crew used to gently rib him about. He kept a battered green cloth-bound ledger of his own, separate from the company's books, where he tracked the daily lumber tallies in his own cramped, careful hand, because he didn't trust anyone else's arithmetic, including the front offices. Ruth called it his second Bible. He carried it under his left arm every working day of his life, as much a part of him as his hard hat. Nobody understood yet how dangerous that quiet, stubborn habit had become. That fall, Earl had grown quiet at supper. Ruth noticed it. He'd started staying late, comparing his green ledger against the shipping records, muttering about numbers that didn't sit right. He told Ruth he thought somebody was stealing from the mill, skimming loads off the top, and that he meant to take it to the owner once he was sure. He told her not to worry. That was the last full week of his ordinary life. On the evening of November 9th, Earl finished his paperwork and locked the mill office at 6:15. A night watchman named Carl saw his flashlight bobbing along the gravel cut toward the field, the usual way home. That was the last anyone admitted to seeing him. At 6:45, Ruth's supper went cold on the table. By 7:30, she'd called the mill and gotten no answer. By 9 p.m., half of Drennan was out along the gravel cut with lanterns and truck headlights, walking the frozen bottomland, calling his name into the pines. They found his flashlight first, switched off, lying in the gravel. They found one of his work gloves 20 feet farther on. They found a dark stain frozen into the frost at the edge of the tree line. But they did not find Earl, and they did not find his green ledger, the one he carried under his arm every day, the one that should have been right there beside him. For 35 years, no one would understand that the missing ledger was the whole reason he was gone. The Pell County Sheriff's Office worked it hard at first, then not at all. The investigator was a young deputy named Boyd Latimer, 29, the only man in the department with any real training, sharp and serious and out of his depth in a county that had never seen a case like this. Latimer did the things he knew to do. He photographed the flashlight, the glove, the frozen stain. He had the stain tested at the state lab, and it came back human blood. Earl's type, though in 1989 that was as far as the science could go. He logged the glove into evidence. He walked the gravel cut 100 times. And he listened early on to what Earl had been saying about somebody stealing from the mill. Latimer thought it mattered. He thought it mattered a great deal. But here is where the case died. The mill was the lifeblood of the county, and the owner did not want a deputy poking through the books, suggesting one of his men was a thief, and maybe worse. Pressure came down. Latimer was told, in the quiet way these things are told, that Earl had probably surprised a transient along the tracks, that it was a robbery gone wrong by some drifter long gone, and that there was no sense dragging the mill's good name through the mud over a tragedy. The ledger theft angle was buried. The drifter theory was the comfortable one, the one that let everybody keep working beside everybody else, and so the drifter theory is the one that stuck. While the official story hardened into something easy to swallow, Ruth Tackett refused to swallow it. She knew her husband. She knew about the ledger, and she knew it was gone, and she told anyone who would listen that no drifter takes a man's accounting book and leaves his wallet. She kept Earl's side of the closet untouched. She kept a lantern burning in the front window on cold nights. The way she had the night the men searched, and she raised a quiet, grinding fury that the county mistook for a widow's grief and learned, in time, to look away from. There was one thing that gnawed at young Boyd Latimer for the rest of his life. In those first days, a mill worker named Vernon Pruitt had come forward to say he'd seen a truck parked off the gravel cut that evening, engine running, and a figure standing by the tree line. Latimer wrote it down. But Pruitt got nervous, changed his story 2 days later, said he'd been mistaken, said it was probably nothing, and would not meet Latimer's eyes when he said it. Latimer always believed Vernon Pruitt had seen exactly what he first said he saw, and had been frightened into silence. He just could never prove it, and Pruitt took whatever he knew and closed his mouth around it for the next 3 decades. By the spring of 1990, the case was cold. There was a flashlight, a glove, a frozen stain, and a missing ledger that the official story pretended had never mattered. There was a widow who knew better, and a young deputy who believed her, and between them, no power on earth to move it. By 1995, 5 years had passed. Boyd Latimer made detective, and then, worn down by the county's appetite for the easy answer, left law enforcement altogether to run his late father's hardware store. He took a copy of the Tackett file with him and kept it under the counter. Earl's son, who worked the mill, couldn't bear the floor anymore and quit. The family that had given 3 generations to that place was done with it. Ruth went on alone. The mill changed hands in 1998 and modernized, and the old gravel cut where Earl vanished was paved over for a new loading yard. as if the ground itself were being made to forget. By 2009, 20 years had passed. The night watchman Carl had died. Several of the men on Earl's old crew had died, taking whatever they'd half suspected into the ground with them. The diner on the square closed and reopened twice under new names and new owners who'd never heard of Earl Tackett. The mill's old-timers retired, and the young men who replaced them on the floor walked across the paved loading yard every shift with no idea what the ground beneath it had once been. Boyd Latimer, gray now and running the hardware store, still pulled the file out on cold November nights and read it by the register after closing, the way some men reread an old letter. He'd long since circled the name Vernon Pruitt in the margin, and beside it written, he saw something. Who scared him? He never let it go, not through 30 winters, and Ruth Tackett, in her 80s now, still kept a lantern in the window on the coldest nights, still told her grandchildren that their grandfather had been a good and honest man who'd been killed precisely for being honest, and still waited, with that iron spine her whole town had learned to look past, for a county that had chosen to forget to finally be made to remember. Every case like this one takes weeks of digging through old records, verifying facts, and trying to do right by families the system failed the first time around. If stories like Earl's matter to you, take a second to subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly helps these cases find the people who still care. Now, let's get back to Drennan. The case broke, in the end, not with a flash of new technology, but with an old man's conscience and a deputy who'd waited his whole life. In the autumn of 2024, a regional cold case unit was formed to review unsolved homicides across rural Arkansas, and a veteran investigator named Sharon Okafor was assigned to the backlog. She came across the Tackett file and was struck by how thin the official theory was, and by a single handwritten note left decades earlier by a former deputy-turned-hardware store owner, asking who had frightened a witness named Vernon Pruitt into silence. Okafor went looking for both men. Boyd Latimer was 74 now, still behind his counter, and when Okafor walked in and set the file on the wood between them, the old man's hands went still. "I've been waiting 35 years for somebody to ask me about this," he said. Vernon Pruitt was harder to find, but Okafor tracked him down in a nursing home outside Little Rock, 81 years old and dying of emphysema, and carrying something heavier than the disease. When she told him the case was open again, Pruitt closed his eyes for a long moment, and the only sound in the room was the slow hiss of his oxygen line. Then he began to talk, in the low voice of a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten how to stand straight without it. He had seen a truck on the gravel cut that night. He had recognized it, because he'd ridden in it a dozen times. And he had recognized the man standing by the tree line in the last gray light, because the man was another mill foreman, Dale Hutchins, who ran the shipping side. The very side of the operation that Earl Tackett's green ledger had been quietly proving came up short load after load. 2 days after the search, Hutchins had found Pruitt alone in the mill parking lot and told him, plainly and quietly and without ever raising his voice, that if Vernon ever breathed a word, it would be the last mistake he made, and that he had a family to think about. And Pruitt, with a wife and 3 small children and a job he couldn't afford to lose, had believed every word, and had said nothing, and had carried the shame of it through 35 years, and into the last room he would ever sleep in. "I let them call that good man a fool who got robbed," Pruitt told her, his voice breaking. "I knew. I always knew. I just wanted to live. A dying man's word is not enough to charge anyone, and Okafor knew it, but it gave her a direction that 1989 had refused to follow, and it sent her back to the evidence room, to the one thing nobody had been able to use all those years before. Earl's work glove, the one found in the gravel, had been preserved in a sealed envelope for 35 years. And there was a second item, almost forgotten, logged the same night. A pry bar found discarded in the brush 100 yards from the scene, dismissed back then as junk. Okafor sent both for the kind of testing Boyd Latimer could only have dreamed of. The glove carried Earl's blood, as expected. But the pry bar, sheltered from the weather under a fallen log all those years, still carried a faint trace of male DNA on its handle that was not Earl's. The profile was degraded, but modern genetic genealogy doesn't need a pristine sample, and it doesn't need a suspect already in any database. Put simply, it takes whatever genetic markers survive, finds the distant cousins who've uploaded their DNA to public ancestry sites, and builds a family tree inward until only one person fits. A genealogist spent 7 weeks building that tree from the pry bar trace. It led to one family long, rooted in Pell County. It led to one man. It led to Dale Hutchins. In 1989, Dale Hutchins had been the shipping foreman, a well-liked man who coached youth football and sat on the church board. The man who had stood with the search party calling Earl's name into the pines he had likely already left him in. He had run the side of the mill that Earl's honest ledger threatened to expose, and when Earl came to him quietly, the way an honest man does, to give him a chance to make it right before going to the owner, Hutchins had made a different choice on a cold gravel cut. For 35 years he had lived 4 miles from Ruth Tackett's lantern. And in 2024, Dale Hutchins was 86 years old, retired, respected, a great-grandfather, a man the whole town would have sworn was the salt of the earth. Investigators recovered a discarded cup from Hutchins and confirmed the match to the pry bar. Combined with Vernon Pruitt's deathbed account and Earl's long-buried suspicions about the stolen loads, the comfortable lie of the drifter finally collapsed. They arrested Dale Hutchins on a cold morning in early 2025 in the driveway of the brick house he'd owned for half a century, not far from the paved-over yard where the gravel cut used to run. He didn't fight it. He looked old and tired and almost relieved, an 86-year-old man in a cardigan held up by a deputy's steady hand. Neighbors stood on their porches and could not make the picture make sense. This was the man who'd coached their fathers in Pee-wee football. This was a deacon, a fixture, a face from 1,000 church suppers. When the truth moved through Drennan that the man who killed Earl Tackett had stood shoulder to shoulder with the search party, had passed the collection plate down the same pew as Earl's widow for 35 years, had killed an honest foreman over skimmed lumber, and let a drifter take the blame, the whole town went quiet in a way it had not been since 1989. The lie every small town tells itself, that the evil that touches it must have come from outside, from some passing stranger, broke apart in that driveway. The evil had been on the mill floor the whole time. It had called Earl's name into the dark and gone home to supper. Ruth Tackett was 91 years old when Sharon Okafor and a 74-year-old Boyd Latimer drove out together to tell her. She received them in the front room, the cold lantern sitting in the window where it always sat. When they said the words that they knew now, that Earl had been right about the stealing, that he'd been killed for his honesty and not by any drifter, and that an arrest had been made, the old woman did not weep at first. She looked at the lantern a long while. Then she said, very quietly, "He told me somebody was taking from the mill. He told me, and I believed him, and nobody else would." She pressed her hand flat on the table. 35 years they called my husband a man in the wrong place. He was a man who did the right thing. That's what got him killed. Hutchins was charged with first-degree murder. He has pleaded not guilty, and the case is moving toward trial. Under the law, he remains presumed innocent of the charge until a jury decides. But for a widow who had defended her husband's name alone for half her life, the truth had finally turned to face the town. Acting on the same long-buried account, investigators searched a wooded tract Hutchins had once leased along the river, and that spring, Earl Tackett's remains were recovered and brought home. Ruth buried her husband with full honor in the Drennan Cemetery, and she set his battered green ledger, recovered at last from the back of Hutchins's old property, where it had been hidden for decades, into the ground beside him. The honest book that got him killed went into the earth with him, its work finally finished. I keep coming back to that green ledger. To a 51-year-old foreman who trusted nothing but his own honest arithmetic, who noticed numbers that didn't sit right and chose, the way a decent man does, to give a thief the chance to make it right before going to the boss. He could not have known that his honesty was the most dangerous thing about him, or that the book he carried under his arm every day for 19 years would be the very reason he never reached his own porch light. The thief took the ledger, thinking it held the only proof. He never imagined that a pry bar under a fallen log, a dying man's conscience, and a deputy who refused to forget would outlast them both and finish the accounting Earl started. There are things here worth sitting with. How does a man coach children and pass the collection plate for 35 years with what Dale Hutchins carried? What does it cost a witness like Vernon Pruitt to swallow the truth for a lifetime? And what does it mean that he finally gave it up with his last breaths? And how many cases were buried not for lack of evidence, but because the comfortable lie was easier for a whole town to live with than the truth standing right there on the mill floor? If Earl's story stayed with you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so these cases keep finding the people who still remember the names. Tell us in the comments what you'd have done in Vernon Pruitt's place and where you're watching from. Some towns choose the easy answer and live with it for 35 years. But honesty has a long shadow, and the truth has a longer memory. Sometimes it waits in a green ledger, in a workman's careful hand, until the accounting is finally fully settled.